Alright, in this video we're going to look at how to do the pink section of your Rainbow Review. So we're looking at this graph and we're asked to find the domain and range and some intervals here. So let's start with the domain. So we can see that along the x-axis it's going infinitely in both directions. So we would say the domain goes from negative infinity to infinity. And vertically we can see that it also goes in both directions. We would say that the range would go from negative infinity to infinity as well. Now the next part asks us to find the intervals where the graph is positive and where it's negative. Now it's positive in those two intervals, going to be negative in these intervals. So let's start with where it's positive. So it's positive going from negative 3 to negative 1, and then beyond positive 4. Now, negative 3, negative 1, and 4, that's where it's exactly 0, and 0 is neither positive nor negative. So when we write our interval, we are not going to include those actual endpoints. We're going to use parentheses. So we're going to say, again, the first interval would be from negative 3 to negative 1. And the second interval went from 4 to infinity. And again, we would not include those endpoints because they are not included. And so then for where it's negative, it would go from negative infinity, and then at negative 3 is where it changes to be 0, and then above 3 is where it's positive. And then from negative 1 to 4 is also where it's negative. So in those intervals is where it's negative. Now the next section is asking us where is it going to be increasing and decreasing at. So I'm just going to erase these. So remember, we read a graph like we read a book. So we go from left to right. So it's increasing up until this point, and then it's going to be decreasing until we get to this point, and then it's going to be increasing again. So it's increasing from negative infinity. We'll say this point here is at negative 2. So we're going to say it's going to increase from negative infinity to negative 2, and then we'll say that this point here is at 2, so it's going to go from 2 to infinity. That's where it's increasing at. Now we could include those endpoints if we wanted to, because technically it does include the endpoints. We'll just include those. So then where it's decreasing at, it's only decreasing between negative 2 and 2. And to find the x-intercepts, there can be more than one of those. There's 3 x-intercepts at negative 3, negative 1, and 4. So negative 3, negative 1, and 4. Now there's always only going to be one y-intercept. And the y-intercept here is at negative 4. Now it says find the rate of change on the interval from negative 1 to 2. So I want to figure out what are the coordinates at negative 1 and at 2. So those are two separate points. So negative 1 is right here at negative 1, 0. And when x is 2, y is right here. So we're finding the slope, basically, or the rate of change between just those 2 points. So from negative 1, 0 to 2, negative 10. So we could just use that slope formula. So we could take negative 10 minus 0 over 2 minus negative 1, which becomes 2 plus 1. So that would be negative 10 over 3, or negative 10 thirds would be your rate of change. All right, let's look at the back side of your pink part of the review. So on the back side, it's pretty much the same exact problem, just a different graph. And so for this one, we can see that the domain is going to be just like the previous one. It's going to go from negative infinity to infinity, but the range is different because it doesn't go all the way down to negative infinity. It has a lowest point. The lowest point is negative 7. So we're going to say it starts at negative 7 and it goes up to infinity. So that would be your domain and range. The interval where it's positive and the interval where it's negative. So this one's positive in this interval, in this one, in this one, it's negative down below. So it's negative here and negative down here. So we're going to label those intervals. So we would say where it's positive is from negative infinity to negative 2. Remember, negative 2 is not included because that's a 0. So 0 is neither positive nor negative. And then it's also positive from 0 to 3. And then from 6 to infinity. It's negative in those dips down below. So it's negative from negative 2 to 0 and from 3 to 6. All right, so the next part is going to, just like before, it's going to ask us where is it increasing and where is it decreasing at. So let's look back up at our graph. It's, again, we read it from left to right. It's decreasing until we get down to where x is negative 1.2. And then it's going to increase until we get to where x is 1.5. And then it's going to decrease until we get to where x is 4.9. And then it's going to increase beyond that. So it's increasing on 2 intervals and it's decreasing on 2 intervals. So starting where it's increasing at, that was from negative 1.2 to 1.5. And then it was also increasing from 4.9 to infinity. And where is it decreasing at? Well, it's decreasing from negative infinity to negative 1.2. Whoops, we can use a bracket there. And then it's also decreasing from 1.5 to 4.9. And then to find the x-intercepts, there are 4 of those. So here at negative 2, at 0, 3, and 6. So negative 2, 0, 3, and 6. And 0 just also happens to be the y-intercept as well. And 0 was the y-intercept. Now we're going to find the rate of change, this time from 1 to 4. So where x is 1 to where x is 4. So we want to figure out what are those coordinates. So we see that where x is 1, y is 3. We see where x is 4, y is, looks like negative 5. So we're going to use those 2 points. So 1, 3 to 4, negative 5. And using that slope formula, we would have negative 5 minus 3 over 4 minus 1. Negative 5 minus 3 is negative 8. 4 minus 1 is 3. That can't be reduced. Our answer would be negative 8/3 would be our rate of change between those 2 points. So that's how you do the pink section. So hopefully that answers the questions you may have had on those.